just go through a couple ideas here. And I just prepared some of these slides, so I'm cherry picking some of them, but we're going to go through some of them more in depth in a minute as well. So basically, if we look here at Ezekiel 32, we have another mention of Asher is there, and all her company is and his graves are about him, all of them slain, fallen by the sword. We also have Hosea 14:3 says, Asher shall not save us. We will not ride up on horses, neither will we say anymore to the work of our hands, you are gods, for in you, Yahweh, the follow us find mercy. We have a ton of different things here. But the Egyptians, when they're referring to specifically about Osiris, he was considered like a sun god, just like Baal was, just like Shamash was, right? We see Shamash being encountered in the book of Judges, in the days of Samson. He was also a sun god. In fact, the word Shamash, if you break down the Hebrew, talks about being a sun god. And so the idea here is the Egyptians worshiped the sun god named Osiris. He was considered the phoenix, meaning the only god that was going to resurrect, and the only god said to be destined to return at the end of time. We even see a small allusion to that in the book of Jasher. Osiris, like I said before, is the Greek transliteration of Asher, and that's important for people to understand. We have some ancient carvings from different nations. These are called reliefs or busts. This is one of Nimrod of ancient Babylon. How accurate it is, I don't know. It could be. But what's interesting is he seems to be holding a full-grown lion. So this is where many people would extrapolate from Genesis 10:8, this idea that he was an actual giant, because it talked about him in the Hebrew being Gibborim. And I would consider, because of what we read in Jubilees chapter 8, with Canaan, who was the cousin of Nimrod, finding the teachings of the Watchers on some rocks that dried out after the flood over time, that they were actually doing practices from before, that they were learning the practices of the Watchers from before the flood and started actually doing them during the days of Nimrod. And so that's why suddenly during this generation, we start to see the rise of the Nephilim again. Now, are these the same Nephilim that we see as a result of the union between women and angels? I would say no, because remember, the Nephilim is a word that just means, we get that word transliterated to us from the Latin Vulgate as gigantes, which is the word giant. It doesn't always equate to being an unclean spirit. It could just mean a really tall dude. Okay. Now, yes, they continually practiced unclean practices and worshiped demons, the unclean spirits. But was every single Nephilim an unclean spirit? I can't make that claim definitively post-flood. Pre-flood, we can make that claim, because it seems to be that seems to be the origin of them and the only mention of them. But post-flood, we see the rise of the Nephilim again, and it seems to be just referred to as tall people. You're welcome to put in the comments if you have some different opinion. But one thing I definitely have learned through studying the Nephilim in depth is that there is no further mention of the idea of angels coming down and do this again, to take wives again and have offspring again. That's why the extra biblical books gives us another extremely plausible way that the Nephilim could have returned, which is just simply through the learning the arts of cutting roots again to create genetic manipulation. So we have this idea in ancient Egypt of Osiris, and he has all these other names for him across these different cultures. And I found a wonderful little chart here that just kind of gives us an idea as it breaks it down over different places, but from the Greek through the Latin, from the times of the Romans and what they would call him, all the way back to the Canaanite languages, the Phoenician languages, even referenced metaphorically as Dagon, the fish god. Because remember, all these personifications were for the different cultures. They would just come up with basically repackaging, the rebranding, right? They're rebranding this god to make it applicable or to make it enticing to that current generation, that current people group, their ways, their customs. And this is what we see today in the world today, as we see these occultic practices made applicable through government policy and through customs in different nations all over the world, which is why we still have the practices of child sacrifice happening in almost every country in the world. It's called abortion. And many of the symbols that are represented for these government agencies point back to Molech. So a lot of people don't realize that, but I'll let you study that on your own. In ancient Egypt, though, we have many, many hieroglyphs that talk not just about sun worship among the pantheon of gods, but also about giants existing. So this one is, we have three different perspectives of people being exhibited in this particular hieroglyph. You've got the giants who are who's clearly the rulers, and they're sitting on some sort of, nice cushions. And then you've got someone sitting on their lap, as well as someone even smaller sitting on their shoulder. Now, I know a lot of people would say, well, look, they're probably just children. And I'm like, well, if that's the case, then the Egyptians, who supposedly built, many of the pyramids and ziggurats and understood proportion extremely well, had no clue how to draw proportion amongst their hieroglyphs, if that's the case. If we're just going to claim these are just babies and children, because proportionally these do not look like babies. So we also have this concept of the bull god, which is Baal, being seen also in Egypt. You can see the son of Ra above him with the rays coming down, just like we see in the hieroglyphs of Egypt. We see Nimrod everywhere, and all the symbols that relate to Nimrod are everywhere. Even in Nordic cultures, we got this concept of Nordic gods. But one thing I just really want people to understand is that Baal worship was everywhere for thousands of years, and it was also heavily identified with the Greeks as well. So the worship of Baal was popular in Egypt into the New Kingdom, and I'll let you guys have study your own Egyptology or history of Egypt about the different kingdoms they had in the different eras, but which would basically be about 1,000 years BCE. So this is around the time of King David in our biblical history, that the worship of Baal was popular in Egypt. Okay, so we don't really get that from the Exodus, do we? It talks about not worshiping other gods, but it takes a little bit of, we do get it, don't get me wrong, but at first glance, it just says, worshiping the gods of Egypt, or worshiping those going back to Egypt and following the ways of Egypt. But many people don't realize that the golden calf was something that would have been made and fashioned as an idol to represent Baal. And so, but that's something that we always attributed to just being an Egyptian thing. Well, the Egyptians were worshiping Baal the same way, because again, it's Osiris, it's Nimrod, it's the same dude. But this idea is that throughout the influence of the Arameans, they borrowed the Babylonian pronunciation Bel. The god ultimately became known as the Greek Belos, and is identified with Zeus in history. So this is something really important for us, because once we jump into this idea of Zeus, suddenly it opens up all the Greek mythology, and you realize, whoa, wait a minute, this is something, this is everywhere. So, because for example, here's a fun little chart about Nimrod and the different names that there were for him, as well as his sister wife. For example, like Egypt, we have him called Osiris. His sister wife is Isis. Assyria, he's Bacchus. His sister wife is Ishtar. India, it's Itzwara. Isi. Asia, he's a name I can't quite pronounce. Dios, I'm not sure if that's how you say it or not. In Greece, he'd be called Eros, with the sister wife Aphrodite, or Cupid in Rome, with also Venus. And so you see what I'm saying? The Phoenicians would be Tammuz, and then Ashtoreth, as far as the Phoenician religion and belief system. But ultimately, we have this strong connection throughout history that Isis, Artemis, Semiramis, was the sister of Apollo, who's also Nimrod. And to the Baalim, remember, I am on a Hebrew word makes it plural. That's why we were talking about the pantheon, the family of gods. To the Baalim, the pantheon, we have in Canaan, that would make her the Ashtaroth, the sister wife, if you will, of Baal and Molech. So this is why they're always associated. Like I said, Jeremiah calls her the Queen of Heaven. But Asher, also Osiris, also Baal, also Apollo to the Greeks, they're all the same guy. And he is the Assyrian. That is the head of the house of evil that Yeshua returns to fight. So these are the little descriptions about the details of Yeshua doing battle against the Assyrian to trample him in Yahweh's land, just like we read in the very first verse in Isaiah 14:25. Habakkuk 3:12 and 13, it says, in indignation you march through the earth. This is at the return of the Messiah, guys. This is the day of the Lord. In indignation you march through the earth. In anger you trample the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. It's beautiful. We have some amazing stuff. Let's just read a little bit more. This is in Micah 5, 5 through 6. And it says, this one, the Messiah, will be our peace. When the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will rise against him, 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. They will shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod at its entrances. And he will deliver us from the Assyrian when he attacks our land, when he tramples our territory. Okay. So here's something to consider. Here's something we just read that Micah verse, right? It says, when the Assyrian invades our land, when he comes in. and it calls them, and then we'll say they'll raise up the shepherds to shepherd the land of Assyria. That's a reference to, once the New Jerusalem is here, the resurrected, we're all going to be the royal priesthood, right? We're going to be ruling with Yeshua as he sits on his Father's throne. Revelation 2, we are given the right, if we overcome, to sit on his throne with him. We rule in authority as in the priesthood that he's in this Melchizedek priesthood, because that is a priesthood that entails not just priests, but also rulership. And so this idea here is that we're going to be resurrected in the New Jerusalem and dealing with those who are outside of the New Jerusalem. And that's where on the day of the Lord, he comes back, he fights the Assyrian, and then we're set down to be the idiomatic phrase, the 7 shepherds that are raised up. And that's a phrase that's used for completeness and fullness, which is why Revelation 6 talks about the complete number of people that must be martyred before he returns. And it's telling those who are complaining in Sheol to wait, because the complete number hasn't been fulfilled yet. And we also see a reference to that in Enoch chapter 48, but we won't go into that tonight. So this idea here is that this idiomatic phrase about those who be raised up as shepherds, and that's going to be the resurrected saints, in my opinion, that we're going to be helping rule and reign from the New Jerusalem over the survivors of the day of the Lord, which in most cases will be the widows and the orphans, which would be the remaining family members from those men who came to battle Yeshua at his return, who joined forces with the beast to try to fight Yeshua at his return. And since the beast himself is working in the authority of the dragon and Satan, as Revelation 13 tells us, anyone that joins forces with him is essentially subjecting themselves to the authority of Satan, right? We see how the hierarchy works right there, which is why when Yeshua comes down with his angels, Matthew 25:31, anyone that's in the way there's no mercy. They're not being spared. And because they just have to be cleared out of that zone, because he's about to set his house down, his city down. As a result of this, all those orphans and widows that are going to be left over are going to come to the city, and they're going to need provisions and help, and they're going to need to learn Torah, Isaiah 2:2-5. The law will go forth from Zion. Yeshua will render judgment amongst the many peoples, amongst the nations. Isaiah 60, the nations will stream to Zion. And we're going to be inside Zion. And as a result of this, we're going to be having to shepherd those and teach them ways of righteousness, which is why Torah, instructions of God, are considered righteousness, Deuteronomy 6:25. And then, of course, this is a wonderful moment here, because in Micah 2:5, this verse that we read, it has this direct connection to the land of Nimrod being Assyria, and how the Assyrian will invade his land. And many people think, well, maybe that already happened, Sean. How do you know this isn't a moment in past of history? Well, we actually see this fulfilled in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And he's referenced as Gog, who comes down into Israel from the north and invades. And I'm going to read some of those scriptures here in a minute. But this idea is that Nimrod himself has okay, let me just back up a little bit, because I want to make sure we're getting some of the proper understanding of exactly who Nimrod is, and as far as what history considered him, because basically it matters to help us understand just exactly why we can make this connection easily with this idea that not only is he considered the Assyrian, as we see referenced metaphorically in Scripture, but he's also Ashur, who's Osiris, who's Nimrod, who's Apollyon, who's Apollo for the Greeks, who's directly named in Revelation 9, and then Revelation 17 tells us that is the beast. You saw it come out of the pit. And it's the destroyer, right? The one who was. He used to be alive a long time ago. He's not now, but he will become again when he actually returns. And which is why they called him the Phoenix in Egypt. So real quick, let me just jump back into my presentation. And this idea here in the book of Jasher, chapter 9, originally the whole word, and this is before the Tower of Babel, it says King Nimrod reigned securely, and all the earth was under his control. All the earth was of one tongue, in the words of unison. So this is an idea that he was originally the king. This is why when he comes back later, they wonder at the beast who was and is again. And they worship him. They follow after him, because they've been worshiping him the whole time, but in symbolic form through idols, right? Through rituals and practices. But now, at this moment in the future, during the 42 months leading up to the return of Messiah, he's actually going to come back in present form. He's going to be able to be seen and touched and talked to. and they're going to be amazed and they're going to wonder after him. The world will follow after him. They're already following after him. The kings of the earth are already worshiping him with architecture, with policy, with behavior, with secret societies, with subtle symbology and all forms of media. You know what I'm saying? Like in every vein they can, in every way they can, those who reject Yahweh, 9 times out of 10, they're gravitating toward the occult, or it's because they're already worshiping him in the occult practices. And many of them are propagated to heads of state, leaders of nations, military leaders. This is why we see the same symbols all over the world in different ways. But let's read real quick when he actually invades Israel, and we can kind of get some context to that Micah verse so we can understand this has not happened yet. So in Ezekiel 39, verses 1 through 5, and it says, "And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I'm against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Mishal, and Tubal, and I will turn you around and drive you on, take you up from the remotest parts of the north, and bring you against the mountains of Israel. I will strike your bow from your left hand and dash down your arrows from your right hand. You will fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops, and the peoples who are with you. I will give you as food to every kind of predatory bird and beast of the field. You will fall on the open field, for it is I who have spoken, declares the Lord." So what did we just read in we just read at the beginning of this presentation in Isaiah 14:25, what he said, I will strike down the Assyrian on my mountains. And then we also read in Micah 2:5, we had the same thing, right? Where it talked about in the land of Assyria, he will attack, he will be trampled, but they will, the Assyrian will invade, and that's what we're watching here. But that Yeshua will defeat him, the Messiah, will defeat the Assyrian when he attacks Israel during this time. And I would say that this time is leading up to the Battle of Armageddon itself, which is why he's coming from the north. And if we understand the maps and the geography, the Valley of Jezreel, which is next to Mount Carmel, is in the northern area of Israel. It's not as far as Mount Hermon north, but it is north of Jerusalem. And it is and therefore it's a great, feeder zone. If the Euphrates is dried up, for them to come down through those valleys and assemble in the Valley of Jezreel, which is also called the Valley of Armageddon, because it's a really large place that could fit over 200 to 300 million people if they crammed in there. And so that's where we get that reference. And that's why we can see stuff later, like in in Revelation 19, where it talks about how the Messiah comes and actually defeats the Assyrian on his mountains. Remember, we kept seeing that phrase. He defeats him on his mountains. So this is not something that never happened with Nimrod. Nimrod never met Yeshua. He never encountered him. He never was destroyed on the mountains of Judea. In fact, according to most historical legends, Osiris was killed and betrayed by someone close to him named Set, and then he was chopped up into multiple pieces, like 13 or 14 pieces, and one of the pieces went missing, and it's a long story, and it's sorted. But here in Revelation 19, we have the actual Yeshua telling us the moment when he does kill the beast on his mountains. Okay, and it says, "Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, he said, Come, assemble for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of commanders, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of those who sit on them, the flesh of all men, both free men and slaves, small and great. I saw the beast, and the kings of the earth, and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse, and against his army. And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet, who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh." So we have the denouement idea. Okay, we have this idea that from Genesis 10, we have the introduction of Nimrod. We have a couple extra biblical books that actually allude to the idea that he had many names. We have the Canon of 66 give us different names and associate all the same occultic practices that Yahweh hated and detested, and these practices that provoked him pointed to this guy who had taken over this quote-unquote pantheon, who has subjected himself to Satan. By the way, in ancient Egypt, they actually called Ra and Osiris, their own little version of a trinity. And so what they would do is they, let me find it real quick for you. So they would actually, I don't think I'm screen sharing. Just one second, real quick, and we'll get to it. But what they would actually do is they they worshipped Osiris as if he was the mouthpiece of Ra, and as a result of that, Osiris, supposedly when he died, now this is just Egyptian lore, we can take it or leave it, but we see these similarities in Revelation 9 mentioned from Scripture. That says that Osiris basically became the god of the underworld after he was dead, which is why when we see him come back, he's in charge, he's ruling over people, but then yet he still says that he's working in the authority of Satan himself. So just in case a lot of people aren't familiar, let me screen share real quick, and I'm going to show you guys some fun stuff. So in ancient Egypt, Ra was symbolized in many forms, in many ways. But one of the ways that he was symbolized was he was considered like a hawk-headed god. And the sun and the serpent wrapped around the sun was always attributed with the same attributes. I don't think this is going to work. Yeah, there it goes. It was always attributed with the same attributes, right? We have the sun, which considered Ra, the sun god. We always had the snake wrapped around it, and a personification of him was a hawk-headed chimera type person. This is why whenever we see depictions of Nimrod, there's always the throne or the hat of authority, the crown, if you will, that always had the serpents on them, because it was connected to serpent, the dragon, right? But throughout ancient history, we would have depictions like this on hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, which the Ankh represented resurrection. This was a clear and dry symbol for Osiris. This little stick here, which looks like it has a strange head on top, it's got like a forked prong bottom. This was considered to be the staff of Ra. The whole purpose of this was that it had authority of Ra. And this little pillar here that we see is called the Djed. And this actually is really fun, guys. This actually relates. So I found out just recently, I've been studying this for years, but just recently, as I was digging deeper into the book of Enoch on our other show on Kingdom and Context, the show Honor of Kings, just recently we discovered that the Djed actually has to do with the tree of life. And so this is where Osiris in ancient Egypt tried to abscond the imagery of the tree of life and use it for this concept of the Djed, which was metaphorically called the backbone of Osiris, which is what was going to allow him to resurrect and fulfill the concept of the Ankh, you know, this little cross with an oval on top, as he moved in the authority of Satan. That's why when we see ancient depictions, we're going to see things of these same images of the staff of Ra. Here it is in his hands. We have Ra, the sun god, over the bull horns, right? Because remember Baal. And that's where we have this idea that he's holding the crook and flail. They hated shepherds, and so this was a kind of a symbol of that. I don't think that's any coincidence, since the Messiah is a shepherd. And Micah just talked about raising up shepherds to rule over the land of Nimrod and the land of Assyria. And of course, there's other symbology about the seat he's actually sitting on, and these things like this, just to explain to him how he's under the authority of Ra. He's holding the authority of Ra, and this is, of course, one of his blue depictions, and that's a whole nother conversation. That his father's abode has fountains, living waters. You've concealed them and prepared them for your kin. Until the kingdom comes and his will is done, our earth will thirst for heaven. Your day